Welcome, innovators, business owners, entrepreneurs, technology experts, academia, government R&D communities, and members of the North Carolina innovation ecosystem. This is Defense Technology Talks, hosted by the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or NCDEFTECH. This podcast will showcase various technologies with local and national experts who aim to solve complex national security problems. In the coming weeks, we will highlight North Carolinians with the potential to, or those that have positively contributed to enhancing the capabilities of our warfighters, law enforcement, and first responders. We will also feature government leaders in research and development who have helped shape the future in this domain. These podcasts are just one of the many free services provided by the North Carolina government to assist the North Carolina innovation ecosystem to thrive and provide solutions to our nation. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Defense Technology Talks. I am your host, Rob, from the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DEFTECH. I have Dr. Dave Smith here. If you don't know who Dr. Dave is, you probably aren't in the space of traumatic brain injury and understanding ways to prevent it. But I'm going to give him the floor and give him the opportunity just to explain a little bit about himself, talk about his journey, because again, this was going to be a special episode. I kind of feel it already. But the reality of it is understanding that you as a founder have a voice in the direction of where your technology goes. And his journey is a very interesting one. And the sacrifices that he has to make and he's made to get to this point are pretty tremendous. And so I'm not going to steal any of his thunder. I will pause there. Turn the floor over to you, Dr. Dave. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Well, thanks, Rob. And then again, publicly, thank you for everything you're doing and have done in your past as well. It's just amazing to read your storied history as well. I'll kind of start from the beginning, at least the academic world. I was a competitive swimmer, so I've never had to understand that I have to actually sacrifice for something. It's an incredibly grueling world, not perhaps what you're doing in special ops, et cetera, but it did lead me to understand that there were going to be times where things didn't go well and you were aching and hurting and had to keep forging through. I went into chemistry, strangely enough. I did it because I was good at it. If any of you are chemists out there, I'm really sorry. We're really boring people. And it was something that I just couldn't continue on indefinitely. And thank God I was a lifeguard, ended up saving a double drowning, and then changed my whole focus of my life and decided I needed to go into medicine. It was the greatest thing to have these young women coming up to me and thanking me for saving these babies. And oh my God, what an ego boost that was for me. But in reality, I started going into pre-med and then medicine at University of Cincinnati, came out of that and went to Case Western Reserve to become a specialist in what's called internal medicine. We're sort of the detectives of the medical world. And Case Western is fairly notable in the Midwest. And it's kind of a juggernaut in engineering and just figuring stuff out and stuff out. And so I left there, and ultimately, because I'm somewhat of an entrepreneur, I had the access to purchase the pilot plant that Pfizer had used to make advanced wound dressings. And wow. I ended up buying this and developing smart dressings, if you will. And I made a name for myself of just being clever, for lack of better words. And clever is something you just can't learn in school. You can't get a degree in clever. And so I found my niche, and ultimately somebody in the medical or military world sought me out to try to figure out a way to help our soldiers not bleed out on the battlefield. And way back in 2008, I found myself standing in the Army Research Lab showing a number of 30 people, for example, and project coordinators, how we thought we might be able to help these soldiers out. Well, interestingly enough, afterwards, the project coordinator came up, put his arm around me, and on a military base, that was an unusual thing for me. And he says, "Damn, Doc, clever stuff." He said, "Listen, I don't want to stop you from preventing our soldiers from bleeding and all, but man, why can't we get clever people figuring out this whole traumatic brain injury thing?" You know, he says, "We've got hundreds, billions of dollars into this, and we haven't hardly moved the needle." And the guy in the front row raises his hand. He says, "I think if someone could just effing figure out how a woodpecker can smack its head into a tree 80 million times and fly away without being harmed, wouldn't this whole thing be solved?" And of course, everybody cracked up. except me. You know, as a medical doctor, I get 30 people walk through that door. I don't know if I have an answer at all.
Yeah.
And so I figured out at that very moment that nature had already figured this out. I mean, a woodpecker smacks its head at 1200 Gs. We tend to get a concussion at 100 Gs with one singular blow. So I immediately had my brain flying like crazy, 100 miles an hour. And by the time we went to lunch, I turned to him and I said, well, sir, I think I've got some ideas. And he looked at me kind of funny and he said, well, about what? And I said, well, 20 minutes ago, you told me to figure out all of traumatic brain injury. And it's been 20 minutes, sir. Shouldn't we get going? And of course, everybody laughed again. And ultimately, I said, well, let me see if I can explain what's come to my head so far. So it seems to me like we're focused on trying to put this big protection around our brains. And honestly, if you and I were in two different vehicles, I'm in a Volkswagen Beetlebug and you're in a big Abrams tank, and we both go 70 miles an hour over into that embankment, which one of us dies? And he looked at me funny. He says, well, of course you die. You've got a tin can around you, and I've got a tank around me. I said, well, respectively, sir, we're both dead. Our brains inside these moving containers cannot sustain a 70 miles to zero collision. The inside of our brains go to absolute liquefaction, and we're both dead. And that didn't solve anything. And sure enough, I started doing research into the world. And in 2016, the lead article in the San Francisco Chronicle was that helmets protect heads, not brains. And that was the statement of the chairman and chairwoman of the Consumer Product Safety Commission and Federal Trade Commission right before they took all these helmets off the shelf nationally and internationally for claiming that they were anti-concussive, and they can't give any data to that effect. So ultimately, started forging out into the world trying to disprove my ideas. So the important thing when you're an entrepreneur, you've got to fail fast. You've got to figure out a way to not spend all your capital and your money and your time and your own blood, sweat, and tears. That's no different than money. So I had resources that I could throw at this, but I was a practicing medical doctor at 70 hours a week. And I had to decide, I really want to go down this path. And I had another company or two and real estate I was working with. So ultimately, started doing and devising experiments. I actually put little blood samples of my own blood in CO2 cartridges that I could actually put an acorn bolt on top of. Went up to the top of my 10-story hospital and started whipping them down into the parking lot. Can you imagine how upset the administration of that hospital was with me?
Sure.
Because a lot of them burst open, couldn't figure the right cartridge to put this in. So there's just human blood spattered all over the parking lot. And they just did not know. I was chief of medicine at the time, so they didn't know what to do with me.
Wow.
Right. So ultimately published the studies that demonstrated that I could fill that cartridge all the way to the top instead of having it partially filled. And by God, we were able to actually reduce the amount of red blood cell damage that had occurred. And so I knew I was onto something because I started calling it slosh theory. And slosh has got a real term. It's in the first chapter of most physics books, and it has to do with hydrodynamics, and it's the study physics and mathematically of how fluids move inside of moving containers. And it's just that in my particular situation, I wasn't just somebody that had physics background, but I also had 700 level math courses. I have chemistry and physiology and biology, and then I'm a doctor, and then I'm an entrepreneur. So I had a lot of these capabilities, or whatever you would like to call it, interests that enabled me to immediately look at a woodpecker and realize that, oh my God, I know what it's doing. It's got the strangest little thing. It's a tongue apparatus attached to the top of its beak, goes up over the top of its skull, comes around and attaches to its omohyoid muscle and to the jugular vein. And then every single time its head goes forward, it occludes its jugulars in 4 different places. So I ended up realizing, you can kind of see behind me, there's a Q collar there, and here's tactical Q collars that we've now devised for the military format, which actually allow a very small amount of compression onto the jugular vein right here. The amount of vein is trivial. If you look on the back of your hand and see a vein and just gently touch it, that's all the pressure I need to collapse that vein and divert the blood into the cranial space. And 4 milliliters, that's a small grape of blood fills into your cranium. And guess what? your brain can't move. So now all of a sudden, if you were in that Abrams tank or in that Volkswagen Beetle and you had your brain contained like an airbag or bubble wrap, the energy of the impact goes right through you. And I'll be straight up with you. Most people thought I was smoking something when I first started telling people that I could take IED forces and make them pass through our soldiers' brains instead of being absorbed. Well, let me tell you, here at Cincinnati, Ohio, we took 30 Hamilton County SWAT officers, half of them with collars and half of them without, and they started blowing up a condemned bank 10, 15 feet away. It's called breaching, and they were crazy people as far as I'm concerned. I was out in the parking lot. I mean, I could not believe how close these guys were. Yeah. And half of them with the collars came out afterwards and they said, "Oh my God, I don't feel fatigued or anything anymore." Yeah. And that's been the history. And I'll leave it to Rob to ask questions at this point. But that's kind of the beginnings of what we started to realize, that we were really onto something, and hopefully can save the brains and personalities and the minds of our soldiers and athletes alike.
Yeah, and I think like we always talk about concussive injuries, but we really don't know what causes them. It's the sudden stop, right? That's really all that it is. It's the sudden stop of your brain against your skull. Even though your skull is designed to protect you, it's designed to protect you from the outside, not from the inside. And I think it's just one of those things that like when you explained it, it seems completely intuitive. I don't understand how people would be like, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense." But like, if I can arrest movement, I can probably prevent it from damage, right? It's the same thing when you set a bone. If I arrest the movement of the bone, then it can heal properly. You know, you would think that it would have been a fundamental answer that people would have been like, "Oh yeah, I get this right away." But again, because it was such a unique introduction, I think people, immediately tend to shy away from something like that. And I can speak for understanding like the effects of concussive blasts. There was one point when I was in Afghanistan that we had to dispose of multiple AT-4 rockets, and we shot about 20 or 25 of them in a day. And when we were done, it was like we had to take the next day off because our bodies were completely exhausted, and literally all we did was we ran a range. Like if it would have been a pistol range or a machine gun range, yeah, it would have been hot, and we would have we could take some time off. But like just the overpressure exposure and those massive concussive explosions, like it wears and tears on your body. So it's not just for, it's not just for the professional athlete that is having collisions multiple times in a game. I would not equate, an AT-4 blast to a football tackle, but I am, colliding into another human being at top speed or as close to top speed as I can get. And so that creates that opportunity for injury. And one of the things that I really like about your technology is the simple fact that it's preventing injuries that we know are going to happen. Because one of the difficulties that we have, particularly with traumatic brain injury or CTE, really bad cases, is we can't find it until it's post-mortem and we do an autopsy on that person and investigate the internal part of their brain to discover whether or not they had CTE. Well, there's, I can go back and watch NFL films and say, that guy's a really good candidate for CTE. Look at the way he tackled people, and that's anecdotal, of course. But if they can add a mitigating step in between there, a collar, and it's just like now you watch all college football teams and NFL teams, right? They have the big, huge, bubble wraps around their head, and that's just to, stave off injury. Or I can remember deploying with a sensor on my helmet, to track how many G-forces I was taking, whether it been a bump or an IED or, any number of things. And what people don't realize is a small 2-foot drop of your helmet. Like if you accidentally dropped your helmet when you were walking out to the vehicle, that's going to set that sensor off. And it's like, oh my gosh, this guy fell hard enough to have a concussive brain injury. And of course, the guys that are doing all the analysis are like, hey, did you fall? How are you doing? Are you, and the other part of it is like, because of the size of the military, the preventative steps that we have to prevent somebody from getting an additional traumatic brain injury, that's one of the things that we don't really talk about. It's not, everybody is aware of the big one. Like if I'm driving in my vehicle and it gets blown up by an AD, everybody understands that big explosion. Like, hey, those guys need to get checked out. But it's the small slip, trip, or fall or something, hey, like I was too close to an explosion or something like that. And those micro, it's like, it's the human body. What makes muscles grow bigger? Micro tears. But those micro tears are actual damage to the muscle. So imagine having a whole bunch of micro fissures on my brain and I'm not really aware of it because it wasn't the significance of an IED blast. Like I just went to a hand grenade range.
Yeah, brains don't recuperate. Muscles do, and that's a major problem. Yeah. Well, one of the things I'll throw out at you is part of our work has been involved in actually relooking at the entire concept of how energy is being absorbed and what is the pathophysiology of a brain impact. And one of the big concepts out there is how can a physics of a blow create the chemistry of a traumatic brain injury. And so I was very honored to give a very cool talk out in San Diego back in 2016 with Dr. Julian Bales. You might remember him. He was in the movie Concussion, played by Alec Baldwin. Mm-hmm. And he was one of my colleagues that believed in me early on. And the bottom line is there's a physics called cavitation, and it has to do with a vapor cavity, a bubble that's formed in liquids. And we believe very, very wholeheartedly that that's been overlooked. It's a theory that's been out since the 1950s, but it was kind of everybody turned left in the traumatic brain injury world around the turn of the century and left it in the dust, and it shouldn't have been. Wow. We can explain a lot of the things that happen to people that the shear strain theory doesn't really work. And so again, it gets back to how could we possibly suppress this thing called cavitation? Well, believe it or not, fill up the container all the way, and a cavitation event cannot occur. So, Rob, if you want at some point in time, I got a talk for you that you would just absolutely eat up. It'll take about 15 minutes. It'll talk about how we are looking at this in a completely different way, and it's enabled us to actually look down multiple different rabbit holes that no one's ever conceived of.
Wow.
And that's where we're at right now.
That's impressive.
Interestingly, my product developer came to me. She is the sound. She runs the sound for her husband's heavy metal rock band. And she told me that she gets a hangover every night. That's just 3 to 4 hours of that loud sound coming in. And she will have nausea and headaches, and she will be exhausted for the entire remainder of the day. And she said, Doc, can I borrow one of your prototypes? Can I just try this? And I said, oh, absolutely. I already shoot with it all the time. So I'll put a plug in my ear and I'll put an earmuff over it, and I still get ringing in my ears because the rest of my head is absorbing all of those sound impacts. And with the Q collar, all that ringing in the ears disappeared. Wow. And she came back and said, oh my God, this is the greatest thing. I hear perfectly. I have no change or decrement in my ability to perceive sound, but I don't suffer after a night of putting this on. So you're right. There's a lot of things that we can do to protect our brains that we didn't know were capable to us. So there's a whole market out there for all kinds of things. And sadly, we didn't go after the military market first. We went after a different market, but I'm here now, and I'm wholeheartedly throwing everything I have into finding a way to help the warfighter, and that's what our focus is. And we've now moved on to yet a secondary technology. It's called CO2 sage rebreathing. This also came from the animal world, because it turns out woodpeckers don't just have this strange muscle that occludes and attaches to it. They also only live in cavities. Now, that's a very strange statement. And it turns out there's all these cavity nesting birds. And I'd never even heard of a cavity nesting bird until I started delving down this rabbit hole. And I'll be damned if all of them aren't predator strafing birds that pull unbelievable G-forces. Look at a peregrine falcon, pulls down or goes down 220 miles an hour, grabs its prey and pulls up before it splatters into Mother Earth, right? Well, the forces that animal should pass out. So we humans pass out at 6 to 7 Gs. How could that animal pull 70 or 60 Gs on that? So it turns out they all have the ability to raise their intracranial volume, just like with the Q collar, but by rebreathing their own carbon dioxide levels. And inside those cavities that woodpeckers live, it's a huge CO2 level. It's up to 5% CO2, which is 125 times the normal CO2 level. And from an arterial side, it does the same thing the Q-collar does, raises that intracranial volume. And it turns out CO2 may have other really powerful implications on reversing brain injury if it in fact did occur. So we've already started studies here in a number of different institutions right now, mostly at University of Cincinnati, and we've been able to demonstrate a reversal of brain damage in those first hours to days after the insult has occurred just by modulating CO2 levels. And oh my God, take a look at this. Our prototypes are so tiny in this arena that they weigh only 2 ounces and they can be crushed down to the size of an egg. In a little bit more sophisticated look, we're working on how we would don and doff them because, again, we weren't in the military arena even a month ago. Yeah. So we're starting to change our whole mindset of how can we put this into an arena that needs to be able to pull them on and pull them off in seconds, not 20 seconds. And so that's what we've already started down that path. And we're literally reaching out to your community to help us in any way, shape, or form, whether it's to help us with bandwidth. We are looking for help from the actual warfighter community so that we can use it in your arena. I've written a book back here called When Heads Come Together. It's an attempt to try to help people understand what we've already come to know and how much more we believe is still in front of us. So if I can shill my book just a little bit.
Absolutely.
Buy it anywhere books are sold, and it's just called When Heads Come Together, and it basically is looking at how nature has been hiding these secrets all along, and we finally uncovered them.
Yeah, and I think that's tremendous, because I think one of the discussions that we have to think about really is there's tons of things that people do that like are based out of nature, like flight in and of itself. You know, being here in North Carolina, home of aviation, right? What was the first thing that the Wright brothers wanted to replicate? How do I replicate a bird's wing to create this lift effect that, you know, up until that point, hot air balloons was probably, the most exciting platform that you can fly with. And that's simple science. You know, if I heat the air inside this container greater than the air that's outside, it's going to lift. And that was super simple principle, but understanding those facets of nature, it's just, it goes into the much grander discussion of the design of, how things work, and understanding how things work literally is, what science is. We have to be able to observe it, and can I replicate that? And the ability to replicate it, particularly in the medical profession, is tremendous because, of course, there's always going to be the question of medical trials, right? And that's what everybody is always concerned with, is like, can I do this in a population that I can get a result, use that result to create a bigger one, or better one, or replicate that result over and over again. And I think that's the scary part of it. And, hats off to you. I got to tip the cap to you, because stepping into an arena, particularly with, brains, is a trepidatious space, because nobody wants to roll the dice and take the chance on, like, hey, if this doesn't work, what are the long-term effects of this? Because we hear that all the time. Like, hey, look, if you get too much CO2 in your brain, it's going to mess you up. If, you have fluid on your brain, we got to drill a hole in it and relieve intracranial pressure. Like, we've all seen that TV show, like, oh my gosh, he's got intracranial pressure. We've got to open his brain up, and like, we've all experienced that. Probably not to the extent that you have, but at least in like a movie or television or documentary or discussion. And then we see that and we're like, I don't know if this is going to work, but you've already proven the science that it does. Now we've just got to trust that, that it's accurate in the sense that you've done it. And now we've just got to trust, like, it's not an issue with your product or your process. It's us as the consumer accepting the validity of the results.
And you're spot on. People have overreacted. So let me give just a quick primer on just CO2, for example, right? We are talking about head ramming sheep, which I just happen to have one here for your audience if they care. And this horn turns out to be completely hollow. You can see that. And if you dip it down into water, you will see bubbles stream right out of this horn. Why would that animal have that? Because it sits on top of what's called a pneumatic horn core. And that pneumatic word means it's connected directly to the respiratory tree. I can literally breathe directly down into this animal's lungs. And no one recognized this until I started going, well, wait a minute. how could this animal do that when we can't do it? And oh, wait a minute, how their CO2 is a partial pressure of 47 when you and I are 35. Well, how does it get its CO2 up? That's not making any sense to me. So I kept digging and digging. Just to give you an idea, the amount of CO2 elevation is 0.8%. To give you an idea, if you burp, that's 30% CO2 on each burp. So if you fear me raising your partial pressure of CO2 by 0.8%, for God's sakes, Rob, don't ever burp again,
Yeah.
right? And then if you ever wanted to go to another distillery across the country, that's 2 to 3% CO2. All of those distillery workers are constantly exposed to CO2 levels 4 times the elevation. You can't even feel what we've done as far as elevating the CO2, yet these really cool things that nature's been devising for 20 million years are what we're going to offer to you. And then one last thing, people will say, well, wait a minute, you're raising the volume and pressure in your cranial. Are you mad? Which, of course, is what it took us so long to get through the FDA. But I just want to point out that when you yawn, you block your jugulars off in 4 areas. So if you fear putting a Q collar on, which only blocks your jugulars in 2 areas, that you may never want to yawn again.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you just simply lie down, the volume and pressure in your brain space goes higher than this Q collar does. So I'm not asking people to trust me. We turned around and did literally $15 million worth of studies, 28 publications with the likes of Harvard, Mayo Clinic, Cincinnati Children's, UC, University of Toronto. I mean, there's no damn way when I'm onto something this big that I'm going to be accused of doing this in my garage. I did it in my garage when I was throwing blood up and down on top of hospitals, but now we have the best minds in the world working on this with us.
And there's a great statement, because I think, I want to keep going, but I also want to keep this around 30 minutes. But the reality of it is deep down in my heart of hearts, what I really want to say is, you have done this right. And I say that because you've established a business. You did what all entrepreneurs do. Like, hey, I've got an idea. I got to test it. I've got to test it. When it gets to the point where I can no longer, facilitate the testing myself, I've got to take it elsewhere. You took it elsewhere, and then you made this thing grow. And so if you're in the listening audience and you're thinking about like, hey, how do I approach the DoD, or how do I even approach the commercial use case? Because I will tell you, from a DoD perspective, what you've done, Dr. Dave, is going out into the commercial space first and then bringing it into the DoD. You probably saved yourself a lot of time, energy, and heartache. And as you previously mentioned, sweat equity is what I like to call it, is, the blood, sweat, and tears that you as an individual put into your company to make it successful. Because if you have commercial success, then you can just have even greater success by getting it into the military. And the other part of it is like, if I look at a company that's doing, 5, 6, 10, 20, $100 million worth of business on the outside, as a government person, I can say, okay, that's my due diligence. If you're one of those international names, or you are the credible authority on this technology, then it makes it a lot easier for me as the government person to look at it and go, yeah, I get it. And the other piece of it is like, we're starting to see that flip flop again. And like, yeah, we're continually massaging what goes into an SBIR, STTR, BAA, and all these opportunities that people are getting. But those numbers are starting to flip. So more of it's in the commercial aspect of it than it is in the military aspect of it. Whereas before, all these innovations were coming out of the military industrial complex and landing in the civilian world. Now the civilian world outpaces, the military significantly by like years, not months or days. It's years. And so all the accomplishments that you have to this point only makes it that much stronger of a use case for you to get into the Department of Defense and really mitigate a problem that, when I was first deploying in the Army, when somebody got hurt and they got their bell rung, it literally was, hey, we're going to give you this MACE test and we're going to ask you this battery of questions. And if you can answer them, then you're able to go back out on mission. And yeah, that may, account for some cognitive issues, but it may not account for, again, those micro fissures or those micro tears or damage to the brain. And then the other part of it is it's like the old nickel cadmium batteries that we used to have, right? So like, if I don't charge that nickel cadmium battery the full way, like the last charge is going to be the most current charge. And that's kind of the way that your brain is, right? So if you bump your head and you don't get it treated or recovered properly, then the highest threshold that you had was the threshold from the previous injury. And I think that's one of the things that we don't really talk about that much when it comes to TBIs, but we kind of intuitively know it. Like, oh man, that guy had, 6 concussions in high school. Now he's in college and he's got 3 more concussions. Well, yeah, because he's never properly healed. So his threshold for brain injury is much lower than it was when he was a 10-year-old Pop Warner player versus being a 20-year-old college football player.
Right. And I'll also leave you with one other thought. I mean, this is not something that the Q30 company is allowed to claim. So please, full disclosure on this. But Harvard did a study that actually used a ball drop method on large swine. They were able to demonstrate that a jugular compression device used to mimic what the Q collar did blocked neurofibrillatory tangles and phosphorylated tau production. Those are the 2 premonitory findings in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Yeah. And so to my knowledge, I'm sure there's people out there that might be able to find others. I don't know. But to my knowledge, I've never seen anything ever be able to demonstrate something that literally ought to change the face of the world of that very scary chronic traumatic encephalopathy that occurs not only in our soldiers, but also in our military and all throughout the world for that matter. It's the repetitive head impacts that we worry about.
Yeah. And genuinely, like, that's the thing that we don't really talk about, like the numbers of paratroopers that there are in the Army. There's 18, well, now about 14 to 15,000 a year go through jump school. How many of those guys make all of those jumps free and clear without a minor head injury? I can tell you that you don't, because just the turbulence of exiting the aircraft probably does some damage to your brain. And so it's a much broader conversation to be had. And I'm glad that you're on the forefront of this technology, because you have something that's viable, and really we're fighting for adoption in the DoD at this point.
And I appreciate it. And I'm here for the long run. We have at least 5 other technologies that we would like to entertain, bringing to the attention of the parties that be within the military. So these things are going to take bandwidth, though, and we don't have it at present. So we need help. We need your help, Rob, and we appreciate everything that you've done to date. But I can tell you that if you think the Q collar is amazing, boy, you're going to love what's coming down the road.
Wow, that's awesome. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. Again, I could talk to you all day, Dr. Dave, and I'm not saying that to be, facetious or funny. You are just a wealth of knowledge, and just not only just from your experience, with the Q collar and getting everything started and moving towards, success that you've had, but it's also, your entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that's one of the things that it's easy to get burnt out when, things aren't going your way as an entrepreneur or as a founder. So, part of the discussion that we have is to bring on people that can breathe life back into the founder that's struggling. Like, man, I haven't gotten that win yet. And usually what I tell people that I work with on a pretty routine basis is just like, keep the faith and keep working, because again, something's going to break, and, catastrophic failure is easy to plan for. I pay off some loans. I shut down my business. I send a note to I send a note to the state officials and say, hey, I'm closing up my LLC. Like, that's easy. Like, that's the easy part, catastrophic failure. But catastrophic success is a completely different thing. How do I scale this in a rapid manner and then do some good with the profits or the proceeds from that? Or do I just continue to, work within the confines of what I've already built? And so I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Again, for Dr. Dave Smith, I'm Rob Robinson, the host of Defense Technology Talks. We really appreciate your guys' time today, and we'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Defense Technology Talks, hosted by the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DEFTECH. The views expressed in this broadcast are solely those of the individual contributors. As indicated, DEFTECH does not take responsibility for those statements or opinions and accepts no responsibility or liability for any inaccuracy or omissions reported during this program. The content and interviews are fair use for instructional purposes and to build awareness for the North Carolina innovation ecosystem. The full version of this presentation has been uploaded to our Mobilize platform. Mobilize is just another free service provided to you to access more national security and business collaboration opportunities. You can sign up for more information at deftech.nc.gov. Join us soon for the next podcast coming to a platform near you. DEFTECH is a subsidiary of the North Carolina Military Business Center and receives its support from Fayetteville Technical Community College.